everybody, and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. This week, we are talking about the immigration protests that began in Los Angeles this last week. We are going to go through that with regard to First Amendment, with regard to the deployment of troops by Donald Trump into California, the deployment of the National Guard, California National Guard, and then the continued subsequent deployment of Marines into this situation. From there, we're going to go into the court decision by Judge Charles Breyer regarding the deployment of those troops by Donald Trump. And we've got quite a bit to say on that case and how he goes into the 10th Amendment, as well as the continued freedom of speech and assembly. From there, we are going to the continued protests, those that came throughout the entire country this last weekend, what they were about, whether they violated any kind of First Amendment freedoms, whether they actually comported with them, and Trump's parade amid the entire chaos in a way. So did there become a time where it rained, literally or figuratively, or both, on Trump's parade, and what was overshadowing it, including these immigration protests, the deployment of the Guard, the continued protests throughout the weekend, as well as Minnesota murders. So this seems to be a politically motivated crime. 2 murders, 2 basically malicious woundings, the attempted murders of 2 others. We're going to talk about that and how that goes legally, what we're looking at in the future for that case, and of course, Iran and Israel. So not too much talk about Iran and Israel because that's not as much legally based, but certainly one of the continuing factors surrounding all of the legal issues with Trump's parade and the continued protests. So, with all of that, I want you to stay tuned with us. I'm Virginia Tarani. I'm an attorney working in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, because you never need a lawyer till you do. I own and operate Tarani Law, LLC, and I'm a former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney. I am joined by constitutional law scholar and Constitution and amending process scholar, Dr. John Vial. He's the Dean of the Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University, and we are pleased to be talking about all of these hot legal issues. Welcome back.
Good to be here.
Yeah, I guess.
Father-daughter thing.
Exactly. Right? Father-daughter podcast. I don't know of many out there. I know of father-daughter singing duos, but I haven't seen any podcasts.
You don't want to go there.
No. Oh, goodness. For neither of us. Yeah. I mean, we might be famous if we did that, but for all of the wrong reasons. Yes, infamous. More infamous. So we're going to talk father-daughter style as well as academically and legally about these issues. And in the meantime, we're going to be drinking. So grab your favorite glass of something or bottle of something. We like to do wine, but I tell you, I have not been to a liquor or wine store for quite some time. So I am running low on supplies. I'm going to have to get some more. So I got something similar to wine today. I've got Izzy Sparkling Apple. It is very much like the sparkling ciders that you have, especially over New Year's. It's quite tasty, so that's the closest thing to wine today. And I've got it in our purple mug that we have online at thelawahunscripted.com. Go to merchandise section. You can get a purple or a black mug that says, allegedly, this is coffee. And Dr. Vial is back at it with his Pepsi.
And you don't happen to have a Tarani watch or Bible for sale, do you?
Oh, good heavens, no. But you know,
one of the fascinating things about the parade is that it was continually interrupted by advertisements that you could buy merchandise for Trump. And apparently, there's a new study out that indicates that just since he's been reelected, he's made tens of millions of dollars currency, sales of Bibles and the like.
I have seen those figures.
I don't think we've ever seen anyone monetize. Well, no, we've had some ex-presidents who have made good money on books.
Oh, sure. Clinton.
$5 or $10 million contracts.
Obama, Biden.
But we've never had someone that I know of in office who was able, and the irony is, this is by someone who's running to clean the swamp.
Yes.
And it has all the appearance. I mean, I just wonder if Biden, well, of course, we had a little feedback against or blowback against Biden's son for,
Yes.
pawning off, maybe that's not the right term, but pawning off artworks for hundreds of thousands of dollars that probably were not worth it.
And deals with foreign countries, including
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, that
Yeah.
was highly disfavored and, comported to the president. It was, oh, well, he's not just making this deal for himself, he's
Well,
making it on behalf of the
and we
President
discussed,
Biden.
there's still controversy over whether this plane that apparently we're going to take from Qatar, whether that is an emolument. Is it
Correct.
constitutionally prohibited to take a gift of that size that ultimately is going into apparently the presidential library or some such. So
Right.
it's a fascinating development, and that it's what's fascinating about it is the more open it is, the less people seem to care.
Right.
And it's a novel strategy for combating corruption charges.
Absolutely. And we did speak about the Qatar
Yes, we
plane
did.
and the emoluments clause in a prior episode. So go back and check that one out, in addition to the others that we have. But that refers to a very specific one that we did. So
And why don't we, if you'll let me, let's just start with this Minnesota thing, because
please.
I know we know so little about it at this time, but it's disturbing. It's not the first.
Right.
Remember, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, the president was discussing, and I don't think he ended up doing it, but he was discussing pardoning people who had planned to kidnap and kill the governor of Michigan.
Correct.
And, Tulsi Gabbard several years back, Steve Scalise. We've had several targeted killings. As far as I can tell,
Or attempted killings.
well, that's right.
Tulsi-
Not
Tulsi
all of
Gabbard
them were
is still
successful. And of
alive.
course, there have been two attempts at Trump himself.
Correct.
One that actually clipped his ear. And so this is a disturbing development. And one of the things that we need to remember, this is the whole purpose of the whole purpose of law is that people don't take the law in their own hands.
Right.
It's interesting. We used to people would talk about the law of the Hebrew Scripture, the Talon. I forget what the Latin is, but basically tit for tat, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And people said that's really cruel. And then they looked into the history of it, and they discovered that prior to this, it wasn't. It was a life for an eye, or a life for an arm, or we're going to burn down your house if you steal from us.
Right.
And it was actually a limiting principle. And when people take the law into their own hands, they've really given up faith in democracy. They're indicating, that they're unwilling to be outvoted, even on key issues, and that the law of force. And again, it's very early to draw conclusions, and,
Yes.
and I don't want to draw too much, but the description that I've read of this presumed killer seems very much like another figure in American history, John Brown.
Yes.
A lot of people don't know this, but John Brown and his sons, they slaughtered families in Kansas prior to coming to Virginia, today's West Virginia.
And this was pre-Civil War time.
Right. And, they did it on the basis that slavery, which it was, is a great moral wrong that needed to be reformed. And it sounds like maybe this person is someone who's strongly opposed to abortion. And, I understand that. I think life is sacred and needs to be respected. But how you move from it's wrong to kill a fetus to so I'm going to kill somebody else who
Right.
has adopted it is just almost incomprehensible. And it sounds like his friends are completely, how could someone who's going out trying to spread the gospel in Africa end up as a killer at home? And
Right.
who knows the answer? But if anybody has thoughts like this, please sit down with a friend, a
Right.
clergy person, somebody, and think it through a little bit.
Seek some guidance. It does appear, according to what I've been reading, that there might have been some kind of manifesto in there.
Right.
Governor Walz of Minnesota has cried it out as a politically motivated
Right.
action where the female Democratic representative, I think she was the state house,
Right.
And she and her husband were killed. And then he attempted to kill the state senator and his wife. And I believe at this time that we're doing the podcast, they're still in critical condition,
Right.
or at least in the hospital, but have not died. But it
But
does,
yeah.
it reeks of, all of the politically motivated attempted assassinations or assassinations. And like you were saying, even Donald Trump, the attempted assassination,
Absolutely.
and then the one that was planned that appears to have been thwarted. None of these are good, and they are against the law, both federal and state laws, and they are considered murder and attempted murder, malicious wounding. It depends on the state that you're in, but these are high crimes, and we don't want to be feeding into politically motivated crimes. We want to have protests. We want to have calm, peaceful discussions, even these protests. But when it gets into the violence, this is where we're talking about not just exercising freedom of speech, not just emphasizing your view one way or the other, but actually violating the law and taking human life.
We forget how important law is because,
Yes.
most of our lives are ruled by laws. Everything from knowing when to stop at a red light to,
Right.
all of these things. But, the founders were very familiar with natural rights philosophy, which, tried to hypothesize what would it be like if human beings lived together without law.
Yeah.
Most of them concluded, in different degrees of optimism or pessimism, but that a lawless state of nature would be a life where, according to Thomas Hobbes, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And when we come together and write constitutions and elect legislators, we're trying to substitute the use of reason for the use of force, and that
Right.
this is one of the famous essays in the Federalist Papers says, we're here to decide whether a nation can in fact be ruled by reason rather than the alternative.
And I'm going to pivot from there. And Dad, you can come up with, all of these quotes and can remember them and when they were done and what article they were in. So I remember the premise of this one, but there's someone out there who, around the time of our Constitution and our founding, I don't know whether it was de Tocqueville or someone else, was saying essentially, well, democracy is a nice experiment that probably won't work. And I know that's a brief summary of what I remember.
Yeah, you're partly remembering it. I mean, basically, there were people at the end of the Constitutional Convention who were not certain it was. I mean, they often referred to democracy as an experiment because we were. Most countries at the time were monarchies.
Right.
Popular sovereignty was basically unknown, and the famous words, presumably, when Franklin left the convention, the former mayor's wife, if I remember, asked him, what kind of government did you establish? And he reputedly said, a republic, if you can keep it. Meaning, the classical philosophers had outlined almost sort of a circle of, you'd have a democracy and it would end up in anarchy and then it would be replaced by dictatorship. And they saw a constant cycle, and the framers thought through separation of powers and checks and balances and whatever that they might be able to get out of this. But recent events are a caution to us.
Troubling.
We're getting ready to celebrate next year 250 years of independence, and I think sometimes I've taken it for, you sort of take it for granted when you have children. Your children grow up in a similar system you have. I'm no longer certain of that, and even less certain for grandchildren and great grandchildren. And
Agreed.
so this is, I think, really a very positive thing. Now, I'm sure people will differ on this, but I thought this No King movement yesterday was very positive.
I
Now,
agree.
to make a reservation, I do not favor. Apparently, there was a little bit of violence that broke out in Los Angeles. In some ways, I believe that was provoked by what the government did rather than natural. But nonetheless, there were hundreds, maybe thousands of demonstrations throughout the country
Thousands.
where people spoke their mind and did so in a peaceful fashion. And that's what, and if others think that things are fine, they have the same right to go out, and if they want Trump to be a king or they want something else, they have the same right to proclaim it as they do. But I really felt it was a very positive moment. And, it came against the background that I think you've already mentioned of a lot of questions about, whether we should be having a parade for the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army.
Right.
And, I don't like to rain on parades. Most people like parades. And I think it turned out actually to be much more positive than most people anticipated. I think the fear was that the stress was going to move away from the army and the people who've sacrificed for us to the fact that it was also a president's birthday. And I'll give Trump credit for particularly the speech that he gave.
Yes.
It was one of the shorter, more measured, moderate, almost self-effacing. I mean, I don't remember him even mentioning that it was also his birthday. And so I think that was very good. Now, whether it was worth the expense, um, that sort of thing, I really not in a good position to know. But traditionally, when you go to a parade, I know you don't like clowns, but but
I do like candy being thrown from floats.
okay, right. I'm gonna say most people when you go to a parade, you think of them as fun, right?
Yes.
These bands playing music, clowns that most people like, candy,
Pretty
beauty queens,
colors, very
right?
flashy.
Right. And what disappointed me yesterday was, at least in the run up to the parade, it seemed to be acting more divisively than it did to unite the people.
Right.
And again, I think the parade itself came off pretty well. And there were not. I don't. I think people have learned. In Vietnam, people would get back from Vietnam and they'd be spit on.
Yeah.
And then I think
The
people
troops.
realized, they were doing their duty. They were doing what their country called them to do. You can be against the war without being against the army, without being against the troops. And the one thing that really troubled me initially about the parade, the last thing we want in the United States is the politicization of the armed forces.
Right.
They need, where I will fault Trump or any other president, and Obama was among them, although I don't think he did it in front of troops. No president should ever be before troops and talk about their predecessor in a derogatory fashion.
Right.
If we respect the army, not because every engagement was a good engagement, but because they're doing their duty, and we respect the office of the president, whether it's Obama or Biden or Trump or Bush or whoever it is.
Right. Yeah, so let me hop in here with some responsive thoughts and then move to some of the First Amendment pieces. I also agree that the parade was better than I anticipated. More tame than I anticipated. The protests, I've always been in support of the protests, whether it's for Trump or against Trump. I do believe in the right to assembly. I do believe in the First Amendment rights that this represents. I was concerned that, and many states were, right? We had at least 2 states, including Texas, who went ahead and their governors called out the National Guard. Right. They called out the National Guard themselves to protect different cities that they knew that demonstrations would be made in those cities. Los Angeles already had the troops from Trump that were deployed by him, not the governor, because they anticipated a state of unrest. And I did too. I'll be quite honest. I was very concerned that what was supposed to be peaceful protests would turn into violence, would turn into a riot, would turn into looting, that sort of thing. But I was pleasantly surprised that apart from this one area, which appeared to be some issues with Los Angeles, and apart from there was an issue the day before on Friday with about 60 people who were either former military, family members of military who went past barriers in order to attempt to do a sit-in around one of the federal buildings. They were arrested, and honestly, I agree that they should have been. They violated the law of essentially trespassing, etc. But that there wasn't violence with it. So it was taken care of. They were arrested. They were charged. And then the only other violence I saw, which was quite unfortunate, were the two different cars where people who were upset about the protests drove into the crowds, drove into the protesters.
One reason they try to get the protesters off the street is for their own protection, because we had this in Charlottesville, we've had it elsewhere, where they're basically sitting ducks.
Right. So the violence seemed to come outside of the protesters, but not from most of the protesters themselves.
You know what impresses me, and I don't know how long it will last, but despite everything that Trump has said about how the city would have burned down and how they're all violent and whatever, most of which I don't believe is true, he seems to have stepped back from some of his immigration policies. He is now saying we're not going to arrest, if I'm understanding.
Yes.
He's saying we're not going to go out on the farms.
Right.
We're not going to go to tourist spots. Apparently, we're not going to take construction workers.
Right.
And frankly, I think the message that Trump ran on, well, it's hard to characterize completely, but the primary message was we don't want foreign criminals in our country, particularly foreign violent criminals.
Correct.
And I don't think there's anybody in the United States who does.
Right.
Except for the violent criminals.
Right. I don't support that either. If they're violent criminals, if they've been determined to be violent criminals, then they shouldn't be here if they're illegal.
So he went from it's like what happened in Nazi Germany. You see a Jew commit a crime and you say, well, all Jews are criminals, so we're going to round them up. So if Trump could step back, Trump has a historic opportunity, and I never thought I'd say this, but Trump could be Nixon in China. So we would never have reestablished, or not for a long time, a Democrat could not probably have reestablished relations with China. Because Democrats were thought to be soft on communism and whatever. They could never. Nixon was a cold warrior.
Yes.
He could come in and say, strategically, it's to our advantage now to do this. Trump might be the only person out there who could say, I ran against immigration. I went to enforce it. And what I discovered is that people are not opposed to all immigrants. They're opposed to violent illegal immigrants.
Right.
And let's close our keep our borders closed.
Sure.
Let's figure out what to do with those that are here and proceed from there. He could make that move. Now, whether he would lose his base, I don't know.
Well, and I'll play some devil's advocate here. The large I won't say the majority, but at least I will say many of the people that I know. I won't assign it to the entire U.S., but I will say many of the people that I know have been scoffing at this move by Trump, where it's seen as, oh, we're being lobbied by the people of great influence, the people with money, of, hey, keep our farm workers, keep our laborers, because we need them to do our job. And there's been an appeal to Trump of, hey, in order to keep our businesses going, the economy going, then at least stay away from these workers versus most of them. I mean, there's no rule about, at this point, ICE is still allowed to go into churches. At this point, they're still allowed to go into schools, which have been, at least coming into restaurants, et cetera. But there's a large base of mass, unions, et cetera, that are saying, hey, don't come into these. So I don't like the picking and choosing.
You actually have something similar with tariffs.
Yes.
Trump seems, and you would expect this from a businessman, right?
Yes.
you would expect him to be fairly attuned to what happens in the markets.
Hmm.
And he does, to a large degree, seem to say, well, maybe I went a little too far here.
Right.
So maybe that's an unusual, it's not exactly your traditional separation of powers checks and balance, but it is a kind of check.
Right. Well, let me ask you, let's talk about the First Amendment with regard to the protests, whether it's the start of the protests in Los Angeles, and I'm going to lump in the No King's Day protests.
Okay.
I want to ask you a couple of very specific questions, and then I want to definitely move on to the deployment of the Guard and the Marines by President Trump, because I think that's a huge legal and constitutional issue. So with regard to the, quote, protests, because that's what they've been called, all of these, including in Los Angeles, First Amendment rights give us several rights to the people that I believe are being reflected here. So I'll say first, the freedom of speech, and second, the freedom of assembly. But I also know that there are limits on those, especially in regard to large gatherings, in regard to where they are doing the protests. And what I want to ask you, with your background in constitutional law, in walking down all of these streets, do they have to apply? Should they have applied to the local governments to be allowed to do that? Should they have been limited in time, place, and manner? Is there something that should have or could have limited these protests and taken away some of their First Amendment rights?
Well, First Amendment rights have been interpreted to embrace reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. So I have the right to protest, but I don't have the right to protest in the middle of an interstate highway.
Fair enough.
I have a right to protest, but I probably don't have the right to protest in front of somebody's house at 2 a.m. in the morning.
Right.
So
And not with threats of violence.
right, and manner, I have the right to protest, but protest doesn't include throwing brickbats. Or hitting people upside the head with 2x4s. That's
Right. Or
so
threatening imminent harm to
right,
others.
and we know, particularly in urban settings, that when you get a lot of people together, there's always, you have sort of the pure-hearted, and then you have the anarchist, and you have people who will take advantage of every situation, and they want to sow chaos. And so you're actually protecting the pure-hearted by keeping the latter from basically hijacking the movement. So, one of the things that Los Angeles has done is enact a curfew. Well, typically you wouldn't want to tell businesses that they got to be, closed by 8 o'clock at night, maybe. But
For people to
if
go
you're
home.
right, if it means you're stopping buildings from being burned and people's businesses from being destroyed, that's perfectly reasonable. Now, what's unusual in Los Angeles is, it's called the National Guard,
Right.
but the person in charge of the National Guard in California is the governor of California.
As in
And that's
each
true.
state, the
That
governor of
in
each
each
state
state,
is in
right?
charge of their National Guard.
That's right. And National Guard are typically used for emergencies. You
State
call them out to fight fires. You call them out when there's a hurricane. You call them out when there's a tornado.
floods.
Yes, some kind of imminent disaster like that. And governors are perfectly equipped to do this. And if they're not, they have an option, which is you can tell the president, we don't have adequate forces here. I can't get adequate authority. I'd like you to, I'd like you to bring in nationalize the guard and take them over.
Or to even send in military troops that are part of the Army, the Navy,
Right.
etc.
Right, but typically we don't. There's a law adopted right after Reconstruction that military is not to be involved in routine law enforcement. They're not. Military are trained to kill enemies,
Right.
trying to kill them. National Guardsmen are actually given training in domestic insurrection, and this has been perfectly clear in California. The Trump can say that he called out the National Guard to preserve order. the the Los Angeles police have been protecting the National Guard
Right.
because their presence is about as provocative as the redcoats marching through Boston prior to the Boston Massacre. People don't want to see federal troops enforcing, local laws.
And
And
that's,
so,
let me stop you there very quickly, because I think that's the biggest point, is what Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, was saying is our Los Angeles Police Department had this under control.
yes,
Yes, there is violence. Yes, we see it. We recognize it. And we have the law enforcement officials,
yes.
those who enforce the law, which is not the National Guard. Those who enforce the law are the local police department, who they're already out there. They are trying to quell it. It doesn't seem out of control. Yes, there's some lawlessness, but we're dealing with it. We are making arrests. We are doing everything to stop the violence. And he was saying, yes, there's some violence, but no more than other cities have been. I mean, look at Chicago. What's the murder rate there? And we're not sending in the National Guard. We have the normal Chicago Police Department. So he and the mayor of Los Angeles were saying, look, we've got it under control. It's not out of control. And like you're saying, the National Guard, even as deployed by the state, is usually a defensive measure. It is not a law enforcement measure.
And again, people need to understand this is unusual. We have not had the president call out, nationalize the Guard since the Civil Rights Movement. And there it was like when Eisenhower actually sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas to prevent riots that had broken out when Central High School was desegregated.
But he also did it in order to enforce the national
That's right. He was
law.
enforcing federal law in that case. Trump, and again, if Newsom had asked for forces, then
Sure.
Trump should have supplied them. But this goes, and we rarely talk about the 10th Amendment, and it's I've written on the 10th Amendment, but it's elusive. It's the powers not delegated to the national government remain with the states and with the people.
Yes, and let me stop you again real quick. And I shouldn't be laughing, but here's why I'm laughing, and I want to explain it so people don't think that I'm laughing at Trump or the Constitution, is I cannot remember the last time I even looked at the 10th Amendment.
Oh, shame on you.
That's really said by a dad. But honestly, I mean, we look at so many others. We look at the First and the Fifth
Right.
and the Sixth. I've dealt a lot with the Fifth and the Sixth Amendments. The Eighth Amendment. We look at the 14th Amendment with equal protection and due process. But I had to stop and really think when I first saw this of what is the 10th Amendment again? Which one is that?
Let's read it. Okay,
Yes.
So we got it out there. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And this tradition, historically, the 10th Amendment has stood for the principle of state police powers.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a federal system. The national government has certain responsibilities, the states have others, and often they share responsibilities.
Right.
Education, welfare, health, and whatever. But particularly when it comes to law enforcement, almost all law enforcement, most laws dealing with property,
Right.
are local laws. They fall under the state police powers. And so typically, governors and mayors, they take care of their own. And if they need help, now that there is a provision in can't remember, I think it's Article 4, which basically says if a state is invaded or if a state faces insurrection, they have the authority to ask the president for help, and he can guarantee that they continue to have what's known as a Republican form of government.
Right.
But essentially, the 10th Amendment argument is basically this is not really something that the national government should be doing, particularly contrary to the wishes of the state government.
Right. And I even looked back up let's talk about the powers of the president so we know what he is permitted to do by the Constitution versus what you're saying for the 10th Amendment is those not specifically listed.
Well, it
Those
doesn't say
powers are to the
specifically.
state.
Right. It doesn't say specifically. The articles did. It doesn't. And that's what makes it ambiguous.
Right.
Because it doesn't specifically list what they are.
Those
But
not delegated.
right,
I'm adding specifically.
Right. Essentially, the president could have acted he's acting under the U.S. Code, which gives him permission to do this in cases where there's a rebellion or invasion.
Right.
And,
of a state.
Right. And when this got to a district court judge, give me his first, Charles. Right? Charles Breyer, who's actually the brother of a Supreme Court justice. When
Stephen
it got
Breyer.
to his court, he looked at this law and he said, this doesn't qualify. This is not there's a difference between, a rebellion against a government is basically an attempt to overthrow a government, to replace it with something else. These were not people who want to replace the government. They're objecting to a particular policy that's being initiated.
Right.
And there's not a formal invasion. You can call, if you can call immigrants invaders if you want to, but they're not coming over as an armed force, all with the same purpose.
Right.
And so he's basically saying that the language simply just does not give the president. This takes us in another awkward field in constitutional law, political questions. So the president says, I'm the president, I'm commander in chief, I can do whatever I want. And generally that's, when it comes to foreign affairs, that's generally true. Courts are not going to second guess a judgment of a commander in chief. But this doesn't deal primarily with foreign affairs. It deals with domestic affairs.
Right.
And the judge is saying, if you look at the language of the U.S. Code, this is neither a rebellion nor an insurrection.
Right.
And given that, the Administrative Procedures Act requires that before a president send in troops, he go through these steps, which include consultation with the governor. Right. How did the governor find out about this? Well, his adjutant general got a memo from the president that said something at the top, saying, this is what the governor says, telling him that we're going to send in the National Guard.
And this also wasn't done after days of unrest. This was done within the next day or two. These troops were deployed. And according to Article 2 of the Constitution, this is Section 2, it does say the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. And here's the tricky part I want to ask you about. It says, and of the, quote, militia of the several states.
And basically today's guards are the old militia. They are state and locally organized and administered. So for all practical purposes, and I believe the official year from this was in the 1931, 32, somewhere along in there. So for all practical purposes, they're the same. But
right, but then there's the Military Act, the one that you're saying with the U.S. Code is the Military Act of 1903, Section 12406 of the Code, that you're saying is he can only mobilize the troops, the national troops, for rebellion or danger of a rebellion, for the invasion of a state.
And the president's saying, well, he has the right to determine when this occurs, and the court says, hold on. The primary interpreters of law are actually judges. We're better at it than you are. And Breyer goes through all these dictionary definitions at the time the Constitution was written.
Right.
And he says, to qualify as an insurrection, you got to have people. If you had all anarchists and they were all there, we want to establish communism in the United States, or we want to bring back George III's heirs or whatever.
Or Arizona's invading Nevada.
Sure.
We have one state's troops invading another.
Right.
We have in this case, I want to ask you another set of questions. And I've got so many. So let me break them up very quickly and then we'll wrap up. one of the distinctions that I want to draw is, how is this different from two different things? How are these demonstrations and protests different than the LA riots after the Rodney King verdicts? And I know you and I both remember those very well, as I watched with you on the news, the violence, and the truck driver, I think, is the worst of all of it, and the pictures and videos. But then the second is the Capitol riots. So let's talk first of, is there a difference between these protests and the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles? And is there a difference between these current demonstrations and the Capitol riots when Trump lost the election?
Again, to my knowledge, this is the first time, and he didn't use this code to do it. This is the first time the president has sent in troops in these circumstances without the consent or the request of the governor.
So the original LA riots after the Rodney King verdict,
if troops were sent, they were sent at the request of the governor. And in fact, during George Bush's administration, after Hurricane Katrina, Bush was ready to send in the Guard to New Orleans, and the mayor said, no, we don't need them. And he stepped back, said, well, if you don't need them, we're not going to send them.
Right.
But here's the irony. You're going to call demonstrations against a specific policy that frankly is being administered in a ham-handed fashion. You know, picking up people at, not Walmart, what is it?
Home Depot, picking them up at Home Depot.
Picking up people at Home Depot.
And a labor union representative.
Right. That is not comparable to what happened on January the 6th of 2021, where you are attacking a Capitol building.
A federal building.
A federal building with people in it, threatening to hang the vice president, and for the purpose of stopping the certification of votes by the legislature of the United States. That is, if that isn't a rebellion, it's about as close as you're ever going to get to one.
And it's also the other piece. And
we didn't got call out.
Right.
The president sat on his hands for 2.5 hours and did nothing while police officers were beaten up.
In
DC. While his own vice president was hunkering down basically in a bunker with his family for his life.
Right. And there were congressmen, congresspeople, representatives who were in the building when it was overrun.
Absolutely.
They were also
George Romney,
hiding.
Not George, Mitt Romney. Very close to being hit by a mob.
Right. There were people who were breaking windows to climb in. There were people who were stealing things.
Yes.
Right. And there were in a federal building. They were overrunning a federal building, which is the basis of our seat of government, not just a state. And in this case, the DC police officers were the ones who were trying to quell this, and they were being overrun. And I do believe that that's different.
Capitol Police.
Oh, sure. The Capitol Police and then the DC Police also were called in to help. And the Maryland Police. Maryland was called to send troops and help with this.
Yeah, it's not a consistent picture here. I mean, this president is having a hard time justifying why you would send them here when you didn't send them before.
Right.
But the key question, here's what we might be missing. As much as I like to talk and you like to talk about the legal issues, a lot of this has more to do with prudence than it has to do with law. The question is, did sending troops into Los Angeles make the situation better or worse?
Right.
And I think the general consensus is that it made things worse. Because, and in fact, what you're seeing now is you're seeing the LA police trying to protect the National Guard.
Right.
Their very presence, much like the example I gave earlier, much like the presence of redcoats marching through Boston, it turns out to be provocative.
Right. They're more upset that the national military is in there. And I think the even bigger controversy was when the Marines were deployed.
Right.
And that was even outside of the National Guard, which is generally controlled by each state. The Marines are clearly only controlled by the United States government, by the executive commander in chief, who is President Trump.
We had something similar to this during the first Trump administration. If you'll remember, I'm trying to remember, I think it was George Floyd. After the murder of George Floyd, there were demonstrations, including some in Lafayette Park, right across from the White House.
Yes.
And there's still some dispute about what happened, but basically, I guess it was, I don't know if it was National Guardsmen or whatever, but somebody ordered that the streets be cleared.
Right.
And when they were cleared, the president walked across the street to St. John's Church, held up a Bible, and got a lot of publicity. And he was joined by General Milley, if I remember. And Milley later said, "I am so sorry." He said, "I did not realize that this was going to be used as a political prop.
Right.
I'm not here to support one president over another." The military is not involved in partisan politics. And we don't realize how precious that is.
Yeah.
How many Central and South American and African and Asian nations have been overtaken by coups?
Yes.
We've never had that because we have civilian control over the military. And for the most part, we've kept, every president likes to wrap himself in the parade, in the flag. And, the president did a bit of that yesterday with the parade. But most of us can still acknowledge, we love our military, we love those who are fighting for us, without necessarily saying that makes me a Democrat or that makes me a Republican.
Nor have we been afraid before, I don't believe, of
that's right.
the military being used by the president against the people.
No,
versus, when we have Hitler using the military and the forces against his own countrymen. We have North Korea. We have those who are specifically controlled by a monarch or a dictator, where, yes, our president controls the military, but it's been of the people and not against the people.
When you join the military, you don't pledge to support the president.
No.
You pledge to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Just like the president has to do in his oath.
Well, he's not sure that applies to him, as I understand it. But yes, I mean, this is a high oath. It's an awesome responsibility. And we don't want to mix them. And this is true of Democrats or Republicans.
Yes.
The Army doesn't belong to you. It belongs to us. To go to the theme of yesterday, we're the kings. There's not a single king.
Right.
One of
the people.
Well, one of my favorite works of propaganda is Common Sense. And when Thomas Paine, January of 1776, says it's time to declare our independence, and he says, well, people are going to say, well, where then is the King of America? And he says, and then he outlines this ceremony where we take a crown and we put it on the Constitution, and we say, in the United States, the law is king.
Right.
And that's what we need to stress during these troubling times.
I agree. Well, thank you very much for this very exciting and lively conversation. Hopefully everybody's learned a little bit about the basis for the laws and why there is conflict among the different states and the parties, the political parties, as well as in the courts. Go back to thelawunscripted.com. We have a whole Constitution review there. We have Dr. Weil and myself, we have done a video review session in 3 parts of it might even be 5 parts, about the Constitution and constitutional law. Catch our other podcasts of The Law Unscripted. The original podcast that we did were about Rodney King and O.J. Simpson. And the second one specifically focused on Rodney King. So catch that as well as our other podcasts and then our merchandise. If you're studying for the bar this summer, grab something funny, lighten the mood, whether it's some of our t-shirts or our coffee tumblers. And then also pick up some classes. We have lectures, we have hypotheticals that you can walk through with us to see how close are you to being ready for the bar. And what we will do in the meantime is we will stay updated on the Legal Weekly News, the hottest, get those published, and we will catch you next time on the hottest Legal Weekly Wine.